Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video about specifics for the GTX 260 OC challenge, which is what I'm going to refer to it as now. Keep saying competition if you want. I think challenge just rolls off the tongue a little easier. So, meet your new best friend for the duration of the OC challenge, the GTX 260, specifically the 216 cores version. There is a version that only has 192 cores, which, for obvious reasons, you should avoid because it will be slower and you'll have a disadvantage. The 216 cores version should be the more popular one, so it shouldn't be hard to get one. So most GTX 260s you get will probably look like this. They'll have a plastic shroud and a blower heatsink. Some of them look a bit different. For example, my Gainward card right here actually had this heatsink on it. There was a fin stack below it, but it had a cooler like this. But most 260s will have a blower heatsink like this. And one thing you gotta know is, just because it has a blower heatsink doesn't mean it is a reference card. So in later generations, like the 600, 700, 900 series, pretty much only the NVIDIA issued reference cards using the reference PCB used blower heatsinks. That's not true for the 260s. A lot of them use blower heatsinks, and a lot of the time they use their own unique PCBs. For example, my Gigabyte card right here has some of its VRM MOSFETs on the back. You will not see that on a reference card. In fact, as far as I know, the reference card has a 3-phase vCore and this is a 4-phase. So theoretically, this is stronger than a reference board. And it is also blue. As you can see, the reference boards are probably normal plain black. So that's probably the first thing you should be looking out for. There are a lot of different versions of the GTX 260. And some of them are better, some of them are worse. The reference PCB is probably one of the worst ones, so if you see one that has like just NVIDIA branding on it, it's probably a reference card. Those you should maybe try to avoid. They will still work. Their VRMs are just weaker and you are potentially putting yourself at risk of having your vCore VRM blow up if you volt mod your card and really push it. The other cards, like pretty much any card that has a 4-phase VRM or better, should be fine. Emphasis on should. There are a large amount of different 260s and I've only tested 2 so far, so I can't really guarantee anything. But yeah, and that's not even all. There are 260s that use a completely different manufacturing process. So there is a 65 nanometer 260 and a 55 nanometer 260. Both of my cards are the 55 nanometer variety, so those 55 nanometer cores are a bit more efficient, and they don't really, there is a slight trend as far as I'm aware of, where the 55 nanometer cores overclock a little bit better. You can tell which it is by the code number, so all of the 260s will be using a G200 core, but the 103B3 part is what tells you that this is a 55 nanometer core B3 variant. If you want to know what the codes for all the different cards are, Tech PowerUp has a very handy spec sheet for pretty much any card. So just Google GTX 260, 55 or 65 nanometer and Tech PowerUp should tell you the exact code that will be on that card. There are some revisions, like you can also get a B2 revision in a 55 nanometer card, so that is not always tracked, but the second number, the 103, should always be on a 216 core 55 nanometer 260. And I haven't tested a 65 nanometer card yet. I know someone who has a 65 nanometer card, and from what they've told me, feels basically the same as the 55 nanometer cards. So the 55s don't necessarily overclock much better. They are also just as fast. There is no performance per clock difference between the two cards. One of them just uses a smaller manufacturing process, and is therefore slightly more efficient. Beyond that, at least at ambient, we haven't really seen a difference. Once you go sub-zero, there might be a difference, where like one of them gets a bit better. I have been told that the 103B3 cores are apparently the best, but by how much they are better than the others, I don't know. Both of my cards are 103B3s, and the Gainward card here is pretty good, and the Gigabyte card is about 20 or so megahertz weaker. So yeah, that's all I know. I only have these two cards. So to reiterate, there's a 65 and a 55 nanometer variant of the card, and there's also very, very different versions of the card, as you can see if you compare the backside of the Gigabyte card and then the backside of the Gainward card. They look very different. They have the same basic layout since they're both 260s, but if you look at the vCore VRM on my Gainward card and the vCore VRM of the Gigabyte card, they are very, very different. And yeah, so there is a lot of diversity in GTX 260s, which is kind of cool, but also makes it a little bit harder, especially when it comes to modding the cards. Now, I will also have a dedicated video about that, how to mod the cards, and I will try to make it as applicable to as many cards as I can. But I can already say that there's some cards that you probably want to avoid. Not that you can really easily look up which ones you want to avoid. For example, this Gigabyte card is one that you would probably want to avoid if you want to volt mod the card. Because after taking the card apart, I saw that the controller for the vCore VRM on this is an NCP 5000 series controller. And those controllers can't be volt modded in the general sense because they will shut down. You need to do a different mod called a VID mod to make those controllers work with overvolting, and that VID mod is much, much harder than a basic volt mod. So if you're a beginner and you have a NCP 5000 series controller, modding your card will be significantly harder than any other card. And that's kind of the bad part. You can't really tell what controller you have unless you know someone who has the same PCB and can tell you. And because there are so many different versions of the GTX 260, chances are no one else has your specific card. I can't say that this red one that you can get from Palette and Gainward is good, because this is using an RT something controller, which can be volt modded in the normal sense, where you just solder something to the feedback pin and then either connect a potentiometer to ground or a EVC to the control port, which is the white wire. The other wire is for a positive voltage output sense, which you don't technically need for the volt mod. Yeah, so if you want a card that 100% will be able to be modded just fine, I guess go for the red Gainward or Palette one. They are pretty common, at least in Germany. Or just roll the dice if you feel like it and get a different card and hope it's not like this Gigabyte one, which is using a controller that's pretty hard to deal with. Yeah. And what else is there to know about the GTX 260? Well, so that's the hardware things out of the way, with like coolers and PCBs that you can get, where again there's a lot of diversity, especially for the PCBs. Now let's get into how these cards kind of work, because they are a bit special, because they have two core clock sliders. So there is a main core clock, and then there's something called a shader clock. And they both affect each other, because the shader clock is at least 2 times your core clock. You cannot put the shader clock lower than 2 times your core clock, and you also can't put your core clock higher than 1/2 of the shader clock. So you always kind of want to have a shader clock that's higher than 2 times your core clock, because otherwise you will be limited by your shader clock. And even though your core could technically go higher, the card just kind of prevents it because the shader can't go as far. And there is a bit more of a special thing with the 260, because the core clock tends to scale with voltage, but the shader clock has been observed to negatively scale with voltage. So if you increase your core voltage, your core clock gets better, but your shader clock gets worse. And if your shader clock happens to go where it is 2 times your core clock, you won't be able to increase your core clock anymore because your shader clock is stuck. So there is a bit of a sweet spot that you want to test for with your voltage, if you have voltage control, which is another thing that we'll talk about. And it makes the other 260 kind of interesting because there's a lot of fine-tuning potential. So if you know how to deal with data and know how to optimize something, you can probably get a pretty good score by just finding the sweet spot of your core and shader clock. So basically find a voltage where they meet, the core clock and both clocks are like at their maximum. Your core clock tends to be worth more score than your shader clock. So basically you want to be at a voltage level where your core clock is the highest. So basically, ideally, your core clock would just hit the stability limit and then your shader clock would still be at that level or like higher than that. But that's not always the case. So yeah, there is some trial and error involved with this. When it comes to memory clock, it is quite important on these cards. Actually in such a way where like this gigabyte card right here, which I haven't volt modded and is still on the stock heatsink, has currently a higher personal best than my Gainward card here, which I have volt modded and run on water cooling. And this Gainward card has a better core. So the memory on this card does about 1260 and the memory on this does about 1300. And thanks to that higher memory clock, despite the worse cooling and slightly worse core, this thing is getting a slightly higher score. Only about 13 points, and it is a 4-digit score that you get at the end of the benchmark. So it is a very small difference, but that 40 extra megahertz on the memory gave this card an edge. So your memory is quite important. It is not as important as, for example, on HW bought cheap-ass chips, where at least for the Radeon round, literally the only thing that mattered was your memory clock. You could underclock your core and get a higher score than top by just having better memory. Which is kind of a reason why we chose 260s and not something super low end. But yeah, so memory clock is quite important. And there are multiple memory chips that you can get. Now every 260 will have GDDR3. And there are Samsung and Hynix chips. We haven't seen anything Elpida based yet. Micron at that time didn't make VRAM as far as I know, but Elpida did, and some other minor brands might have also done it. But the only chips that we've seen so far were Hynix and Samsung. And there may be a few different revisions of those chips. I think there are at least 2 different Samsung revisions. There is a Samsung H die, which I have on my red card, and some other Samsung chip that I don't know the name of. And then for Hynix, I don't know if we've seen 2 different chips yet, but the trend for the Hynix cards, like this card, my Gigabyte is a Hynix card, the trend for the Hynix cards is that they tend to clock a little bit better at ambient. Once you go to low temperatures, that might change. And once you start modding it, that might also change, because Samsung chips usually scale with voltage pretty well, whereas Hynix chips tend to be a bit fiddly. They are very inconsistent. Sometimes they like voltage, sometimes they absolutely hate voltage, whereas Samsung chips usually like voltage. So if you leave your card completely stock, a Hynix card would probably be better, but if you get better cooling or a volt mod going on your memory, a Samsung card might win again. And then there's also the thing where the other chip, the other Samsung chip, I've been told the H-die chips are fine that I have, but I've also been told that there is a Samsung chip that you can get on the 260 that actually hates cold temperatures. Now, very cold temperatures, so you have to go below 0 to have that effect, but basically that one Samsung chip that might also float around that I don't know the name of, that one apparently has a cold bug where if it gets too cold, it will either lose a lot of stability or actually just stop working. which makes those cards kind of hard to run, especially given how much memory clock matters. So in terms of memory, there's quite a lot of variables that we can't really tell apart right now what you actually want. I'm quite happy that I have both a Hynix and a Samsung card, so I can just test what is better. Though with that said, again, this card again has the vCore controller that can't really be volt modded, so I think at the end of the day I will be locked into the Samsung card, the red Gainward card right here. But yeah, so that's how the core and memory clock works. Another how to run it item is your operating system. So we have seen a very slight performance advantage to running Windows 7 versus Windows 10. It is a very small difference, but it is a difference. And I think we've also seen a small boost from using the LOD tweak, which is a software tweak that you can do in the NVIDIA Profile Inspector that makes your image very blurry but gets you a little bit more performance. That tweak is allowed because we're using HWBot rules, and HWBot does allow that tweak. So yeah. But generally, software optimization, there is work to be done. You can get extra score by optimizing your software, but it is not as massive as, say, GTX 500 series cards on Windows 10 versus Windows 7, where they get like 10 to 20% more score on Windows 7. For the 260, it seems that you can run Windows 10 just fine. You might get a little bit less score, but not a very huge amount. Though with that said, I would still recommend Windows 7, but if you can't run Windows 7, it's not a massive deal. Another thing that I've been alluring to, so voltage control. I have been told that the 65 nanometer reference cards have voltage control. Those you will just have a voltage slider in MS Afterburner where you can directly key in how much voltage you have. I think they go to like 1.3 volts, like a pretty high voltage. The problem being that the reference cards kind of suck. Like if you go over whatever that is, and if you have a good enough cooler, you might want to actually go over 1.3 volts. At ambient temperatures, some people run 1.45 or even 1.5 volts into their graphics cards. And I have a feeling those reference cards will not take that much voltage. Unfortunately, most other cards, so the non-reference 65 nanometer cards and pretty much all 55 nanometer cards, as far as I know, do not have any software voltage control. So instead of seeing a voltage slider in MS Afterburner, you will just see nothing. It will just be grayed out and not displaying any value. You will be able to see your output voltage in GPU-Z, but you don't really have any way to affect it, which means to get voltage control, you need to volt mount your card like I did here. So yeah, that is a little bit of a drawback. Yeah, it's one problem that you just kind of can't get around without a soldering iron, which is kind of intended. Like, again, this competition is meant to get new people into the topic of extreme overclocking, and experienced people will just do the volt mod and not really care about it. But it is also kind of meant to get new people into it, and I will make a video about how to volt mod these cards. It is really not that hard. Like, if you have an EVC, literally just one wire, and then another one for reading the output voltage. That's how it is. And if you don't have an EVC and want to use it with a potentiometer, it is still very, very similar. You basically also only need two wires and a potentiometer, and then as an option, maybe a switch if you want to disable the volt mod. So it is not hard. Like, it is a mod that you can totally do. It's just that you need to do that mod if you want voltage control on most of the cards. And that also means you need to have a soldering iron, and you'll have to like buy some wires or potentiometers, which is not gonna be expensive. Like, you will be fine with, probably will be fine with a $15 or euro, whatever, like Radio Shack. I know they don't exist anymore, but I don't know any other name of like discount store soldering iron should be fine. One trick that you can do is actually just like heat up the PCB with a hairdryer, and if it's just a little bit warmer, you will have a much easier time soldering to the card. That's one thing that I can recommend. But we'll talk more about that in the dedicated video. How to volt mod these cards, just be aware, if you want proper voltage control on the majority of the GTX 260 cards, you will have to do a volt mod. Which both makes it a bit less accessible, but also is kinda good because it forces people to do that mod. And like, since these cards are super cheap, you don't really have a risk of losing anything if you break it on accident, and it really isn't a very hard mod. Like, it takes a special amount of effort to break a card while volt modding. Doesn't mean it can't be done. I have in fact done it to at least one, but if you pay attention to what you're doing, you should be able to do it just fine. And then I don't exactly know if there's anything else to say about the GTX 260. So yeah, that's what we're working on, that's what we're overclocking. This is the GTX 260, this is how it works, how it ticks, what's important about it, and how to make it go fast. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you take it as a guide to participate in the competition, I wish you good luck. If you're just using this for general info, I also hope that I managed to help you a little bit. And we'll see each other next time. Goodbye.